Look, it does represent a real challenge to the Pacific Islands Forum. There's no doubt that everyone would very much like Kiribati in the tent, and they are worried about the way that it's just been drifting steadily away from the forum. But we should also try and keep it in perspective. We have to remember that only 12, 18 months ago, it really did look like all 5 Micronesian nations were going to quit the forum, and that was really going to splinter it and potentially deal it a not fatal but very severe blow. Now, that prospect is no longer in view today because of the fact that all nations in the Pacific Islands Forum, with the exception of Kiribati, have now signed on to the Suva agreement. And that means that largely the Pacific Islands Forum is going to stay whole. And that does represent a really big victory for Pacific Island diplomacy and for Frank Bainimarama, Fiji's Prime Minister, who has, not entirely by himself, but played a very crucial role orchestrating this agreement.
And how significant is the final communique that they have released, given, you know, they've been struggling, Pacific Island nations, to get the world to acknowledge the existential crisis that they've been facing?
Yeah, well, that was really at the heart of some of these concerns. The Pacific's strength has always come from unity, particularly when it comes to climate change. They've had an outsized presence on the global stage, advocating for urgent action. And one of the keys to that success, of that advocacy and that solidarity, has been the fact that they've been unified, not just through PIF, but more broadly. So anything that tears at that sense of solidarity, that sense of unity, of purpose, is damaging potentially to Pacific diplomacy, particularly on climate change. And that's why there was such anxiety about the consequence of this split. There was a fear that if PIF was split, that when it comes to climate change, when it comes to regional geopolitics and trying to resist the overtures, at least at times, of some of the major players, that PIF would be weakened. And that's why I think many in the Pacific will be relieved by the fact that most, although not all, Pacific nations are now back under the same tent.
Australia's Prime Minister made it a priority to indicate and to communicate that Australia had changed its position. On climate change, how convinced are Pacific nations that that this has been a serious change?
Look, there's no doubt that Pacific Island countries are welcoming of the fact that the Albanese government is taking a more ambitious approach to climate change. Pacific Island nations have lined up to make that very clear. They welcome the fact that there's a more ambitious 2030 target from Australia now, and they're happy with the emphasis that the government is now placing on this issue. But that doesn't mean that they're entirely at ease with what Australia is proposing. We saw Frank Bainimarama, Fiji's Prime Minister, say very, very clearly indeed late last night after meeting Anthony Albanese that he urged the Prime Minister to lift targets so they're consistent with keeping warming to 1.5 degrees. We've also seen a number of Pacific Island countries say publicly that they don't believe there's any room for new coal or gas projects, which is something that Australia is continuing to approve. So it does represent a test, but Anthony Albanese was adamant that in all of his private meetings, this question didn't really come up, not even the question of coal and gas. He said it simply wasn't raised by Pacific Island countries. Now, even if that is the case, and I guess it probably is that it wasn't raised directly, there's no doubt that Pacific Island nations have made their priorities crystal clear. They have said publicly what their priorities are and what they expect, not just of Australia, but of all major emitters. And the reality is that Australia's targets as they stand do not match with what the Pacific Island nations have said publicly are their core demands.
Yeah. China's security pact agreement with the Solomon Islands has also been very contentious. Where do you think things now sit in relation to China's desire to have a much bigger role within the region?
It has been contentious. It hasn't been a major focus, at least within the forum. It's been a big one on the sidelines and in conversations here in Suva. But there's no doubt that there is a sense of unease about some of the things, not all of the things, but some of the things that China is doing in the Pacific. We saw that in the press conference held by the Secretary-General of the Pacific Islands Forum, Henry Puna, when he was asked questions about China's recent push to sign a sweeping regional agreement with 10 Pacific states. Henry Puna said that agreement was was basically presented as a fait accompli to Pacific Island states for them to sign without any real engagement. And he said that was why there was such pushback. So there is a growing sense of unease. I don't want to overstate it, but there is a bit of a growing sense of unease in some parts of the Pacific about what China is doing here. On Solomon Islands, well, Manasseh Sogavare met the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, last night. He gave a very clear guarantee that there'd be no military base, no Chinese military base under the Security Pact. Mr Albanese said this morning and again this afternoon that he took Mr Sogavare at his word and he was confident there wouldn't be. I have to say, though, that confidence isn't necessarily shared by everyone in Canberra. They remain uneasy about the prospect of Chinese army personnel or perhaps police coming into Solomon Islands, being permanently stationed there. That prospect is still a live one in their minds, no matter what the Prime Minister says publicly.
Yeah, we'll have to watch and see how it plays out. Good to talk, Stephen. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Beverly.